Good afternoon, good morning, good night, good whatever time of day you're listening to this. Welcome back to the Cut Through Nutrition podcast. You are joined by myself, Dr. Joshua Walrich, and my co-host, who's not going to say his name.
Oh, I thought you were going to say.
Well, I mean, my co-host, Alan
were
Flanagan.
on a roll.
I'm sorry. We still don't have an intro. I think I'm okay with that.
Yeah, listening back, I kind of like the fact that we just launch into it. No frills, no intro.
We'll create some sort of theme tune maybe at some point, but it will probably be really subversive. It probably won't be.
Let's not do that.
So in the last intro and 3 episodes, it has been brought to our attention, and also something that we were planning on talking about anyway, that it can all seem a little negative. Some of the stuff that we've been talking about, and in one way that has been relatively deliberate. We've been of the opinion that if we're going to talk about some of these issues in a bit more depth, and therefore be able to come to some conclusions as to how we express this kind of information, we need to know where the pitfalls and where the problems are to start with. So although it might seem a little negative, I think all of this stuff that we've been talking about, or I hope all this stuff we've been talking about, is really important to have context on before we move forward into how do we give out information to people. If we're unaware of the context and the concerns, then it's very easy to fall into those kind of traps when giving out information.
Yeah.
But we'd like today to be slightly more positive, if we can. And perhaps instead of it feeling like nutrition is so complicated, there are so many issues, there can't be any real good advice that can be given out. Clearly, we know nothing about nutrition. Where do we even start? We might as well just eat cornflakes all day, every day. I don't know why I picked cornflakes there. Maybe it was the crunchy nut
cereal.
reference. It was the cereal reference you did a couple of episodes ago. So we're going to talk a little bit today about what we do know in nutrition, or I'm going to ask you a bit about what we do know in nutrition. And I may also close the window behind me.
Yeah, that's a good
because there is
idea.
some building going on. So
it's just cracked
hold
out of
tight.
a mower. That's hilarious.
I'll cut this bit. It's
Where
fine.
the fuck is he?
Oh, what? I can't see it.
Yeah.
Oh, shit. Hang on.
Right.
Okay. All right. I've closed your multiple windows. So we're going to talk a bit about what we do know in nutrition, and perhaps have a bit more of a positive episode this time.
Yeah, I think so, because we can very much get lulled into this idea with the debate. And most people are seeing this debate online, right? They're not seeing it in, the context that scientific debate certainly would go back and forth, which is through academic journals and this kind of thing. So most people's confusion is stemming from a conversation that's often somewhat disconnected from the actual research and the evidence base. And that can be a little frustrating because people can portray nutrition as a field that it is relatively new still, but they can portray it as something that gives us no reliable answers. That's not true. And from multiple lines of inquiry, we can now in 2019 form some pretty broad brush overall conclusions about health promoting diet patterns. And I say patterns there pluralistically because that's the case. There is no one true universal human diet. And we can kind of within each element of those characteristics of a healthful diet pattern tease out some nuances. And so we do know a lot in nutrition. We certainly know enough for action. The barriers that prevent that information being put out into practice on the wider scale really have nothing to do with the field in terms of what's on paper, and more to do with barriers that I think we'll discuss more in future episodes. I think to start with, though, it is helpful to talk about a bit of historical context for when most people think of nutrition, they will think of nutrients, or if they think of nutrition advice, they'll think in terms of nutrients. They'll think, sugar or fiber or saturated fat, for example. And it's not that those characteristics aren't relevant, but the focus of the field in certainly the last 10 years has very much been moving away from just looking at those constituents in isolation and thinking about them in the context of the total diet pattern that they are provided in, and what's the relationship of that characteristic to other dietary variables in that diet pattern. The reason we had the very nutrient focused kind of reductionism in nutrition, when the formal science started evolving, the first vitamin wasn't discovered really until 1913. We knew that there were things in food that seemed to have a positive impact on health. We didn't know what the constituents were. And so the real kind of early golden age of nutrition science through the kind of 1920s and early 30s was very much oriented around identifying what these constituents were, isolating the individual macronutrients, finding out what food sources they were provided from. And the reason this was so important was because public health issues at the day very much related to deficiency states. So in areas where there will be low sunlight exposure, rickets was quite common. Malformation of the bones in young kids. We had epidemics of goiter throughout Europe, which is a result of an iodine deficiency.
Or can be.
Or can be. And in the United States as well. We had incidences of conditions like beriberi in the Far East. Pellagra was kind of relatively widespread. And all of these conditions had a very particular nutrient deficiency that was causative of these conditions. But the thing about these conditions was they have very short latency periods. So if you don't consume fruits and vegetables at all, you will develop scurvy symptoms relatively quickly speaking, as in within a matter of weeks, for example. And so when you provide that nutrient to an individual with a deficiency state, they recover quite quickly. So symptoms onset quickly, people recover rapidly. So they have short latency periods. This kind of reductionism served nutrition well in its infancy as a science and served public health well. These conditions were all eradicated. So
at that point, you could almost say that the food is medicine rhetoric was helpful.
Right, it actually could have been. Yeah,
helpful at that point. It wasn't the concerns and the problems that we highlighted in the first episode about it weren't there. And so the rhetoric had its purpose.
It had its purpose and really was beneficial for public health. So vitamin D was fortified in milk from 1933 onwards. Pellagra was pretty much eradicated by fortifying flours with vitamin B3. Vitamin B1 is fortified through a range of foods. And iodine was fortified in salts, as in table salt, sprinkling salt. And so these interventions were actually really successful. When we fast forward to now, the conditions that we are faced with, chronic lifestyle conditions, the word chronic being important, they develop over the long term. If someone has a heart attack at 60, it hasn't come out of the blue. The actual progression and the natural history of the disease has been coming sometimes, if you look at atherosclerosis, since they were in their 20s. So these are long latency conditions, and the influence of diet on these conditions is going to be a long-term influence over the course of the lifespan. So having realized this, the focus is now very much on total diet patterns. And part of the reason for that is it doesn't really make much sense to focus on something in isolation, even if there is enough evidence to say, well, something in isolation may be having an effect. Low fiber intake, for example. We know that, yes, that's an isolated characteristic, but we want to focus on the foods that provide fiber in the diet, increasing them.
I mean, which is going to be more helpful, advising the foods or advising you go and take fiber capsules?
Exactly.
For example?
Yeah. Increase your fiber means very little to most people at the population level. And also, it's the idea that nutrition by nature is defined by substitution effects. So if you reduce something in the diet, it's going to be replaced with something else. And so a lot of the key health determinants are influenced by what you replace something with in the diet. And they're important considerations. So here we are in 2019. It's not that the nutrient focus is redundant. It's not, because we still need to understand mechanisms. We still need to understand how something does act. But we also understand now that it's not enough to stop there, that we then step back to the big picture of where does this nutrient fit into a total diet pattern? And do we have evidence from diet patterns consuming this nutrient? Is there evidence from those populations of benefit or harm? And what is the relationship of that particular nutrient, for example, with the balance of other nutrients in the diet? And investigating at that kind of food-based diet pattern level a bit more. So when we do add this body of research up, though, that we have been evolving, for nearly 100 years. I wouldn't say that a lot of the early work contributes to now, but certainly from the 1950s and 60s onwards, we have an evidence base there that is more reliable than people give it credit for. And at the broadest levels, we can debate the nuances, but at the broadest levels, we kind of know what characteristics of healthful diet patterns are. And again, I emphasize patterns because there are many ways to skin a cat in this respect. It's just the characteristics are often quite similar.
So I guess, therefore, my question could be, as a bit of a too long didn't read, or as often written on the internet, TLDR. What would you say, for example, because I know certainly in my job I have very limited time with patients. I don't have hours to go through different nutrients and different foods and different ways that they could improve their diet. And it's also not my area of expertise to be able to do that. But there are often situations where people will ask me, but I want to improve my diet. What should I do? And I know it's not just myself. I mean, my partner's a physiotherapist, and I know that she often gets people asking her too. So anyone in a healthcare professional capacity will often get asked these kind of things by members of the public. So what would, as a TLDR, a good kind of answer, we can go into a little bit more depth in this episode as well.
The broad answer.
What would the broad answer be to what can you suggest? I want to improve my diet. What's important to that question?
The caveat preamble to answering this question is we do accept that what I'm about to say in terms of advice or the general what we know has barriers to doing it.
Yeah,
so just
of course.
we're putting them aside for the purposes of this discussion. And
I mean,
we're just talking
some of
at
those
the level
barriers,
of food.
ethics is a barrier. People's previous kind of chronic disease state is a barrier.
Yeah,
some
they're
people
within home factors, socioeconomic status,
exactly.
all this stuff. So we are
to
accepting.
clarify that, we did say at the end of the last episode that we would be talking about socioeconomics.
Yeah,
in this
we're
one.
doing a whole episode on it.
So we are going to do it, but not this episode. We're going to do it in the next episode, but it will make sense.
We thought the order would be better if we talked about the kind of broad diet stuff first,
and then
then discussed how some of these socio-economic and environmental barriers prevent it from being implemented, because it can sound easy in conception. We fully accept that it is not. But let's, with that caveat, go back to the question. So I think in terms of incontrovertible facts, the one thing that I think everybody in nutrition would agree with is eating plenty of vegetables, fruit, and within that a spectrum of stuff that has different colors is a cornerstone of a healthful diet pattern. The reasons may not just be as simple as the micronutrients in those foods, but may extend to bioactive food components. So these are constituents of the food that are biologically active, but they're not nutrients. We don't actually technically need them for survival, but they actually do have activity in the body. So as an example of that group of compounds that have got a lot of interest are called flavonoids, and they would be found in things with a very dark pigment skin, so kind of purpley, dark reddish things. So there's a growing body of research that suggests that actually those compounds and a broad mix of those compounds are actually, one researcher terms them lifespan essentials. So we don't need them for survival, as I said, but in terms of the beneficial effects that they have, they may be actually really important for our overall health across the lifespan. So I consider vegetable and fruit kind of consumption like an incontrovertible fact of nutrition. Like there is just nothing that could suggest that there is a lack of evidence for that.
Am I right in thinking that the public health messaging in the UK of 5 a day is actually under
Just a compromise.
Actually the evidence would suggest that something
10.
like 8 or 10
8 to
is
10.
actually the ideal number, but no one was going to hit that.
Yeah, in terms of maximal reduction in risk, one of the things we look at when we look at nutrition exposures, part of the reason why a lot of the research appears quote unquote weak in terms of the association with an outcome is because they often don't look at a spectrum of units of exposure, so to speak, in terms of intake. So 1 serving, 2 servings, yeah, but as you go up servings, daily servings of vegetable and fruit intake, you get progressively greater risk reductions, relative risk reductions for all chronic diseases. However, public health is not in the business of just mandating like strict, this is what the evidence says, because it has to be mindful. Public health messaging has to be mindful of accessibility of the message and whether people can and cannot engage with it. And that's really where 5 a day was settled on. There's no, and people say, oh, 5 a day isn't evidence-based. No. And there's nothing wrong with it not. It's a compromise to try and make an accessible target for people.
I mean, 10,000 steps isn't evidence-based. I think
Right.
the evidence at the moment is more like 4,000 or 6,000.
Is it? Oh.
Yeah, apparently it's a lot lower.
Oh.
But
So
but
they're
anyway,
the other way with that. Yeah.
Well, exactly.
So that's
reassuring,
That's one characteristic that I think is relatively incontrovertible. In terms of the really now dogmatic and quite ridiculous conversations about dietary fat, even though people in the field will debate the extent to which we were or were not right about saturated fat and heart disease, the one thing that I think is relatively uniformly accepted is that even if we're wrong on that, I personally don't believe we are, but I'll go into that in more detail in future episodes.
Yeah.
But even if we are, it's quite clear that unsaturated fats are just better for you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in the concept of relativity and dealing with nutrition as a matter of probabilities, you know, even if there's a probability that saturated fats weren't as bad for you, it's very clear from the research that unsaturated fats from marine and from plant sources, so we're talking fish, we're talking, you know, plant fats, nuts, seeds, oils, and that kind of thing. And again, that's supported by diet pattern research. When we look at the Mediterranean diet as probably the reference UK, in the UK, there's the Med diet's the reference healthy diet. But we see it in the Japanese population as well. Even though total fat content isn't as high in the traditional Japanese diet, the composition of fats is the same. It's primarily unsaturated fats from certainly a lot of marine sources.
And we will go. We will do a few deep dive episodes on fat in general.
Yeah.
But am I right in thinking, from what I've read so far, that the reason why there's a bit of a controversy on some of the saturated fat stuff is because there's been some evidence to show that if you replace saturated fats with carbohydrates, then it doesn't have much of an impact.
Right.
But if you replace saturated fats with unsaturated fats, then you improve health. So there was some...
Yes. So part of the suggestion there was, well, the first thing is, what people tend to open that with is cardiovascular disease remains the leading cause of mortality. Therefore, we must have been wrong about saturated fat. Cardiovascular disease rates have come down by 52%. It's an enormous reduction. In 1962 in the UK, there were 166,000 deaths from coronary heart disease. There's something around 80. So it's not that 80 is an insignificant number, and yes, it remains the leading cause of mortality, but there has been a massive reduction in total incidence. And I think we need to remember that in this conversation. And yes, reductions in smoking have been an important part of that and other lifestyle variables, but certainly the reduction in saturated fat has contributed to that. The other nuance there is that where that came from was, oh, well, people have lowered saturated fat. It's around 12%, for example, in the UK, on average 12.7. They'll say, well, because cardiovascular disease is still the leading cause of mortality, we're eating more carbohydrate and sugar. Therefore, we must have been wrong, and it was always carbohydrate and sugar. Well, first off, a effects of substituting saturated fat for carbohydrate appear neutral or there's no risk reduction in analyses that do not stratify carbohydrate intake by carbohydrate quality.
Okay.
So when you actually, and there's a couple of papers, any papers that find a neutral effect of or no benefit to substituting saturated fat with carbohydrate typically haven't separately analyzed whether the carbohydrates were from whole grain, unrefined sources or refined grain sources.
Yeah. So my mind automatically goes to there, perhaps the reduction in saturated fat actually did benefit, but they were eating a lot of kind of non-whole grain sources of carbohydrates, which kind of balanced out
in the modern modern diet pattern, in the quote Western diet pattern, it's predominantly refined sources of carbohydrates. So you do not get a risk reduction necessarily if it's refined carbohydrates that have been substituted. People have interpreted that to mean that carbohydrates must be worse, refined carbohydrates. I think the answer is palpably obvious. A diet high in one, either, or both is problematic. And it's not a case of one being worse than the other. It's context dependent. If you go back to the 1960s and 50s, when saturated fat formed 20% of the UK diet, 23% of the Finnish diet, sugar wasn't particularly high in the diet. Heart disease rates, were where they were. That is one contributing factor. The most interesting isolated case study that controls for in a roundabout way these other variables comes from the Finnish public health intervention that they launched in 1972. They had the highest rates of heart disease mortality in the world. They targeted 4 risk factors across the population: saturated fat, blood pressure, smoking, and BMI. And over the 35-year period that they ran this public health intervention, BMI didn't change in the population, it increased. Smoking didn't change in the population, which is a nice comparative to the UK where it did. And blood pressure had a slight reduction, but they reduced cardiovascular mortality by 80%. And of the 4 risk factors that they targeted, 80% of that reduction came from reduced blood cholesterol levels across the population. So the Finnish case study lends a lot of weight as a long-term example of when those other factors like smoking and weight and stuff like that are taken out of the picture. So you're right about that kind of, I suppose, controversy over saturated fat being replaced by carbohydrate. But when we replace it with whole grain, high fiber, unrefined sources, we get a reduction in risk.
Okay.
Now, interestingly, the reduction in risk even from carbohydrate, unrefined whole grain carbohydrates, is not as substantial as the effect of substituting saturated fat with unsaturated fat sources. And that's been, so this is where I think public health still says, swap your saturated fat with carbohydrate, right? And obviously they mean whole grain. But that's not the most efficacious thing that people could do with their diet. The most efficacious thing is and the reason that apparently what I have been told from friends that I speak with in public health, the reason that they're scared to make that suggestion is because there still is this dogma within public health that dietary fat drives fat, weight. So it's a weight-centric perspective they're taking on that evidence. Oh, we can't tell people to swap fat and eat more of another type of fat but I just think with where we're at now, that's probably being a bit short-sighted because it's not like we've done anything at a population level with weight. So anyway.
So am I right? So from what you've said so far, more fruit and veg, more variety,
yeah,
and more unsaturated fat and less saturated fat in general? Would that be a generalized
if you're eating more unsaturated fat,
you would assume
by implication someone is not going to be, if you're opting for oily fish versus steak, if you're opting for olive oil or rapeseed oil versus butter, you're going to naturally have that substitution effect. But yes, it would mean that you don't go putting butter in your coffee, There's no isolated food that is high in saturated fat, like a steak or some nice lamb, is going to be problematic. It's just, you don't base your diet around meat and
frequency
butter.
Of
it's a
intake.
frequency and it's a total intake thing.
Yeah.
So, and what's interesting within the unsaturated fat, which we'll deep dive into in more detail, is that there's even a hierarchy within that. So polyunsaturated fats, which are the types of fat found in fish and in certain plant nuts and oils, have the greatest beneficial effect when they replace saturated fats in the diet, particularly for reducing heart disease. Monounsaturated fats were actually neutral for years. People couldn't really figure out why, but that was an effect of focusing too much on the nutrient.
No, that as in coming from where the monounsaturated fat's coming from.
So that was the key question. So when people were doing analyses, they were finding, monounsaturated fats might even increase your risk, but they weren't looking at the food sources. Okay. Monounsaturated fats are as prevalent in animal foods as they are in plant foods. So when we think monounsaturated fats in nutrition, we're typically thinking Mediterranean diet, olive oil, almonds, they're all monounsaturated fats. But actually, if you were to have, lard, for example, people would assume in their head is pure saturated fat. It's 52% saturated fat, 48% monounsaturated. So you get monounsaturated fats from animal sources. And so what a lot of these analyses were reflecting were high animal fat diets, both saturated and mono. A really, really nice analysis in 2018 from Frank Hu and the Harvard crew basically stratified monounsaturated fat intake by source. And again, substitute with plant-based monounsaturated fats, we get the reduction. Substitute with animal, no risk reduction. So with monounsaturated fats, we're still looking at the plant sources. So really there's a hierarchy, and it favors polyunsaturated fats, followed by monounsaturated fats, followed by complex whole grain carbohydrate, with no benefit to substituting with obviously refined carbohydrate sources.
So would it be right for the general advice to be plant-based sources of unsaturated fat plus fish?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
Fine.
Nice synopsis.
So I guess that therefore, because otherwise this isn't going to be a TLDR. This is going to be a long time.
Yeah. It's hard to TLDR.
I know. Well, this still is going to be a TLDR compared to we have 3 episodes teed up on cardiovascular disease and diet. So yeah. And they'll probably be an hour and a half each. So I guess that leads on to, that could lead on quite nicely to protein, seeing as we just touched on animal sources. So what would be the kind of overall advice in regards to protein and also kind of animal sources of meat?
Right.
I don't think necessarily animal products comes into that, although I get it because, but anyway, animal source of meat. Let's make it general.
Protein has been a funny one because
you'll lose your gains if you don't eat protein.
For years, protein was kind of one of the scare nutrients, and people hearing this might in 2019 find that hard to believe because everyone's all about the protein and the gains.
It's not something I've come across.
But if you fast forward or fast back, even 15 years, there was still this idea that high protein diets damaged your kidneys.
Yes.
Which was based on quite poor research. It was a false positive, basically, from research in the 1980s. Looking at urinary metabolites, it basically suggested, there was an increase in glomerular filtration rate, and it was just like, that's not a sign of...
I know we're not talking about people with specific conditions, but there is still, but to touch on that very briefly, there is still a bit of a hesitation, I know definitely from within CKD. A hospital in regards to, people with chronic kidney disease.
You don't have high protein diets.
Is there, so is that still something
the clinical
that is
nutrition
sensible?
Intervention for CKD is low protein.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're not talking about people with chronic kidney disease, by the way.
Because that is quite a large percentage of the population.
Yeah. So. And then I think the pendulum swings in nutrition tend to be extreme. And the other part of the problem now, the obverse of the coin, is that because protein got such a renaissance through the kind of bro and strength and conditioning realm, that now people are almost dismissive of it, and it's funny how these conversations get saturated, right? There is a lot of evidence to benefit to dietary protein across a range of different health outcomes. It's the most satiating macronutrient we have. We have direct mechanistic evidence for why that is. It tends to act on gut hormones and peptides that are involved in signaling fullness, basically, and and they communicate directly to brain areas that dampen what's known as the hedonic response to food cues. So protein's quite filling. The advantage, for example, that was suggested to lower carbohydrate diets is probably more properly attributable to the dramatic increase in dietary protein that people have on those diets, and they're fuller for longer, and these kind of variables. In terms of specific populations as well, I think there's a growing consensus that higher dietary protein intake in the elderly is quite beneficial, because as we age, our skeletal muscle tissue can become resistant to anabolic signaling. So they call it age-related sarcopenia, where people can start to lose muscle mass, and that contributes to frailty. And actually, if you look at issues in the elderly in terms of morbidity, they often come with loss of independence. So I think there's quite a focus now in age-specific kind of population group nutrition for higher dietary protein intake in that population to help preserve lean muscle mass, so they can preserve mobility and kind of more thriving physical activity.
Well, we know that overall strength as you age is massively associated to improve quality of life and reduce morbidity and mortality. So if protein is going to be related to that in terms of helping muscle
people,
mass.
you need basically kind of a higher threshold to try and help overcome that kind of resistance to signaling. Yeah. So protein is a beneficial nutrient. We don't need crazy amounts of it. That's where the kind of the bro-centric approach to it came. However, the RDA of 0.8 grams per kilogram often gets touted to be, well, this is sufficient for the majority of the population. It probably is, but that doesn't mean that there are not benefits to perhaps a slightly higher intake than that. In terms of what you were saying in food sources, this is one of the really nice examples of why it's important to step back from nutrient focus and look at foods contributing in diet patterns. So the plant versus animal protein thing came from a lot of observations that associated a benefit to plant proteins. But if we think about plant proteins for a second, they don't exist in isolation. If you're consuming a lot of plant proteins in food-based terms, that means you're consuming a lot of legumes, chickpeas, lentils, this kind of thing. You're consuming a lot of nuts. You're consuming foods that are high in fiber. They're high in these they're high in unsaturated fats. They're high in a lot of beneficial compounds. So the food...
It's that replacement effect again.
It's that replacement effect. And it's the effect of the actual foods themselves. So being a little reductionist and thinking plant protein without actually contextualizing the foods that provide plant protein, someone that's eating a lot of plant protein by default is probably consuming quite an overall healthful diet pattern. They have to be if they're consuming a lot of this. Whereas a lot of the associations with high animal protein intake comes in the context of a typical Western diet pattern, where it's consumed in the context of refined grains, low dietary fiber intake, possibly also a lot of added sugar, and potentially higher saturated fat intake as a result. So the actual animal proteins themselves are not uniquely harmful. It's not that cysteine is different in a chickpea to a chicken breast. And some of the plant-based community have latched on to this marker known as TMAO. And they've said, oh, it's one of these things that's a gut bacteria derived compound that seems to be elevated in people with, for example, heart disease. And they've suggested that, well, actually, people with more plant-based diets don't produce TMAO. People with animal protein do produce TMAO, and that must be it. And a really nice study published looked at the kind of bidirectional causality of that. Like, is TMAO increased as a result of diet or as a result of other factors? So, for example, with this, I actually found that increased TMAO was consequent on having diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Like, that was the underlying issue. So people had metabolic derangement. It wasn't necessarily that, the animal protein per se was doing this. And then the other confounder there is fiber. Fiber tends to be really high in people on plant-based diets. Yeah. We know that the gut modulating effects of dietary fiber are what they are. So I personally think at this point, the plant-based peeps are really over-exaggerating the TMAO link as it relates to animal protein. And ultimately, where we are now in terms of factoring in environmental considerations and stuff like that, I think really a diet that probably has a mix of, and this assumes someone's ethical and moral position involves, consuming animal produce, for example. So if that applies to people, then a mix of animal and plant sources of protein is going to be beneficial. But it's less to do with the fact that the protein comes from a plant versus an animal, and more to do with the actual food matrix that's providing it.
Yeah. So if you're reducing if, for example, you're doing 1 day a week meat free, the irrelevant almost as to whether or not the meat is beneficial to you, it's more the other parts of your diet that you're going to end up eating during that day.
Yeah, you're probably going to make I don't know, like a shepherdless pie with a lot of lentils. It's like you're now.
I don't think pies have shepherds in them, just to.
No, but this pie doesn't have a shepherd. That's the whole point. It's now shepherdless.
Let's see.
I don't know, like whatever, you're making in that kind of like plant-based.
Yeah, I know what you mean. You can have more
realm.
veg. You're going to have more variety.
You get more veg. You get
You're going to have
your.
you're going to have your lasagna with aubergine rather than with pasta, which is
There was a really nice study a few years ago that actually looked at this issue as it related more so to kind of weight loss metabolic syndrome, but it looked at the composition of protein in the diet. A higher total protein diet, like 27% energy from protein, and one with 18%. But one diet had 2/3 animal and 1/3 plant protein, and the other had the opposite. It had 2/3 plant and 1/3 animal protein. And there was no difference between the two in terms of any of the outcomes assessed. So I think that the message isn't that, like animal protein, as we tend to talk about it, often has to be contextualized against the background diet that high levels of animal protein intake are going to be consumed in. And that's often, as I said, Western diet patterns that have certain other characteristics that maybe and for me, the characteristic that would probably be most implicated would be low dietary fiber. There was a really nice paper in 2009. Brinkworth was the lead author, but it looked at basically the effects of protein, higher protein diets on gut. So all of the outcomes were like the gut microbiome, basically, composition of bacteria, protein degradation byproducts, and this kind of thing. So both diets had 170, 180 grams of protein a day. That's a decent whack of protein. But one diet with 11 grams of fiber, which is the national average, and the other diet with 30 grams of fiber. And the negative effects were only observed in the 11 gram of fiber a day diet. So that suggests that actually the impact of dietary protein potentially in the gut is modulated by the presence or absence of fiber, and that if you're consuming a high fiber diet, that's protective. And there wasn't any of these protein putrefaction or any of these kind of what they were measuring in terms of potential negative outcomes observed on the diet with 30 grams of fiber a day. So the message here is, again, everything in nutrition is a relationship and context and balance. The message for me would be dietary fiber is as important as we think it is.
But again, because you said at the beginning we're looking at food, not nutrients, would you agree that it may be sensible from a general advice perspective to suggest that the typical Western diet, who are going to be the kind of people we're going to be seeing in general because of where we live,
right?
It may be overall, removing some of the nuance, maybe overall beneficial to say reduce the amount of animal protein that you consume in your diet, or would you not say
I would
that's
focus more
helpful?
positively on helping them make food-based swaps to increase fiber intake. Like if they're consuming, white sliced pan bread, for example, get them to swap it for like a brown loaf that's high in fiber. Tell them to look at the fiber on the label, and things like that. I think we can probably do more in that respect by guiding people towards substitution of foods that are predominantly, say, refined in source to foods that are unrefined whole grain versions. So, oats over breakfast cereal or something like that. And even a lot of like granolas that are available now are actually much higher in fiber than they once were, because people are adding like nuts and stuff to them where previously they weren't. But those types of substitutions, I think, for example, if you look at the fiber difference between a whole grain pasta and a white pasta, like, it's huge. So these are pretty simple substitutions to be able to guide people to.
Well, that leads us nicely onto carbs in general, I think, seeing as we're starting on fiber. So we've talked about fats, protein, and so moving on to carbs, what would be the kind of general state of where we are as you pick up a
Hysteria
a carbohydrate laced strawberry right there?
Yeah,
with all of that sugar.
The general state of where we are is utter hysteria. I think I said earlier that the pendulum swings in nutrition are extreme, and I think that's quite true for carbohydrates. It's really funny though, in a way, the level of hysteria that we have around carbohydrates. I mean, there's this idea that there's been this surge of carbohydrate into the diet, and most of that was based off flawed research. Better, more kind of quantified research has, for example, even with high fructose corn syrup, people said, oh well, it's high fructose corn syrup came into the US diet in the 70s, and bang, we can just draw a straight line for chronic lifestyle disease. It's like, well, no. And there was a nice analysis done a couple of years ago that actually looked at contributions to increasing caloric intake, which has increased kind of to an average of maybe, depending on your estimates, 500 to 700 calories a day in a lot of kind of typical diets. But it found that glucose, not fructose, and dietary fat were actually more contributing to total daily energy. So, and then within that, we have to talk about the percentage of carbohydrate in the diet, which again, people think, significantly increased. But actually, the macronutrient composition, certainly of the UK diet, has been remarkably stable since the 1950s. Dietary fat overall was much higher in the 50s, up around 40+% energy. Carbohydrate was often kind of pretty much steady at 48 to 52% over that period, and remains at that. So it's not that the quantity of carbohydrate has increased as a percentage of diet. The quantity of total energy has increased in all population diets. But what's significantly changed has been our food supply and our food environment. And, with carbohydrate, rather than really get bogged down in all this kind of, almost environmental issues driving, changes in the food supply and stuff like that, I think it's just the easiest to state that the difference is whole grain refined versus refined at the simplest level.
Whole grain unrefined.
Whole grain, versus refined. So whole grain versions of carbohydrate and other carbohydrate foods like our kind of legumes and pulses, and even certain, squashes and colorful, what are considered vegetables because of their micronutrient composition, but, our starchy foods as well. Like these foods are, there's no evidence that there's a detriment to these foods to human health. There's only evidence of benefit. And it's a benefit that accrues from their fiber content. It's a benefit that accrues from their micronutrient content, their polyphenol, or these what I mentioned earlier, these bioactive food components. So equating, a chickpea with a can of Coke is ludicrous at the level of logic, but it's quite literally what is happening now, where you're seeing people at conferences present carbohydrate foods equivalent to teaspoons of sugar. And that extends to a banana. It's not a banana anymore. Yeah. It's 5 teaspoons of sugar.
Well, there was that show on the BBC called The Truth About Carbs, where they had...
That got slated though, didn't it?
Well, fortunately.
They
just had lots of different food sources, and they had it next to a bowl of sugar cubes.
That's ridiculous.
And they were talking about, this is how much sugar you're putting in your body every time you're eating this food. And they had it with potatoes. They had it with, what do they have? They had it with a muffin. And then they had it with something else. And I was like, these are not the same.
No.
And it's just encouraging that fear
right.
that is around at the moment, around carbs.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know this is slightly off point, but I think interestingly, I think a lot of this obsession with carbs has come from a heightened awareness of diabetes and its effects on our health, and it's come from that inference that just because carbs can be really important when somebody has diabetes, it therefore has led to this myth of sugar is what causes diabetes in the first place, and therefore carbs are bad. We should avoid carbs, and again, we've got 2-3 episodes teed up, planned on diabetes and diet and things anyway. So we won't go into that in detail.
Let's touch on that sugar point, because it is interesting. like the idea that sugar is new, you know, this agent that emerged into the human diet again in the 70s, it's farcical. Like, if you really want to talk about sugar sweetened beverages, the first sugar sweetened beverage in the UK diet was tea. In the 1740s, when the global kind of trade network was really under British control and was very much focused on sugar, tea, and spices as commodities, the average family in Britain would have dissolved up to 4 pounds of sugar in tea alone in a week.
Wow.
That's a huge amount of sugar. Problem is they weren't eating much else. So they were still faced with nutrient deficiencies, malnutrition, and these other variables. In the Industrial Revolution, the composition of the average worker's diet was 15% energy from sugar. That's higher than it is now at a population level. You know, sugar fueled the Industrial Revolution.
But they all had diabetes, right?
But none of them had diabetes because, again, despite 15% sugar in their diet, they weren't eating much else.
Yeah.
So again, hunger, malnutrition, and one of the interesting public health points that supports that issue is when the First World War started and they were bringing in recruits. And you were talking about 27-year-old men who hadn't attained any sort of trajectory height for that age because they didn't have enough nutrition growing up. So they were all stunted. And so sugar is not any new phenomenon in the human diet. It has been ubiquitous in consumption since the 1700s when the imperial trade routes opened up to that extent.
And it sounds like, from what you're saying as well, it's not even that it's becoming a higher percentage of our intake either.
No, it's just obviously total energy intake now is higher across the population.
So I was going to ask you about that, just if I can.
Yeah.
I know I'm putting you on the spot slightly there, but there has been a fair bit of talk, and I wasn't sure. I've seen some conflicting evidence. I was wondering what your opinion was on it. There's been a fair bit of talk in regards to people saying that actually our energy intake, our calorie intake has gone down.
Right.
And that there is evidence to show that. So I'm just wondering where, because you're saying there's evidence to the contrary.
I think that two things. One, I think sometimes with scientific inquiry, we just need to use some empiricism as well and common sense. There are increasing trends, not only in developing countries, but in low middle income countries now, of population-wide increases in BMI across the board. And the percentage of higher ends of BMI, I'm talking 40, 50, is increasing as a percentage of that. Unless someone has somewhere violated thermodynamics, then I cannot see how that is supported. However, that's a kind of flippant...
Yeah, I know, because it's
a more common sense response.
It is complicated. I mean,
it is, but at the level sometimes of common sense, we can step back and say, well, okay, that what I've just said for me is reason to question that information.
Yeah.
If we have increasing population trends in adiposity and decreasing energy intake, those two violate all of what we know about human nutrition and thermodynamics. No matter the nuance, that is still the backdrop. So what plays into that is a couple of factors. One is it's increasingly difficult to quantify food intake outside the home. However, we know that as a percentage of energy, daily energy consumed away from the home, i.e. not prepared in the home or anything like that, has increased. It's very difficult to model that at a population level.
Yeah.
And there are then gaps in the estimate of energy expenditure, or of energy intake from attempts at recording that at a population level. I think rather than look at estimates of energy intake, because that's assuming we know what an individual is actually eating, it's more instructive to look at energy availability in the food supply per capita. And those mathematical modelings and those quantifications consistently indicate we have massively increased energy availability in the food supply.
Yeah, makes sense.
So I think that's a better metric than trying to quantify energy intake. I think that the energy intake is a measurement error. That suggests it's decreasing is more a kind of measurement error, potentially influenced by focusing on demographics where there's a lot of reliance of consuming food away from the home or that is pre-prepared. And so I still question that. And you are right, it has been suggested. I don't at this point necessarily agree with it. And I personally prefer to look at energy availability in the food supply as a metric. So, and again, you know, the availability of energy, as we know, is ubiquitous. And one brief point to make on that as an example, but we will talk more about the specific research in the next week's episode, is that we know, for example, that the density of fast food outlets is highest in the areas of greatest social deprivation in the UK. Yeah. So these are not coincidental, and I think it's important to kind of factor those things in as well.
And we know that just from a preparation perspective, that type of food is going to be more energy dense than food that's prepared at the home.
It has certain characteristics: high energy density, high dietary fat, high sugar, and or refined carbohydrate, because we do separately quantify them.
Well, make it as palatable
and
as
high salt, and they are highly palatable foods. They are very easy to consume, a lot of energy, and they are very cheap. Yes, exactly. So all of this plays into the socioeconomic stuff. We'll go into more detail, but to kind of bring it back to that this carbohydrate hysteria, I think that it is really important that we kind of reaffirm the status quo. There isn't a single diet pattern in the world that we associate with really positive health outcomes that is absent carbohydrate. People in the very low carbohydrate ketogenic camp used to love citing the Inuit as an example of people who just drink whale blubber and apparently have robust health. But it's more that weird romantic fetishism that comes with, you know, this perception of people who live hunter-gatherer lifestyles as robustly healthy. That research that suggested they were robustly healthy from a dietary fat perspective came from the 1970s from a group of Danish researchers who looked at their omega-3 fatty acid composition. They had a lot, and they thought, oh, well, maybe this is a really positive characteristic of their diet. Every single piece of research that has looked at that question since then has found nothing positive. And in fact, the best study that kind of really just blew this Eskimo myth out of the water was published in 2014 by a group of Danish researchers again, who compared a Canadian Inuit population with age-matched Danish controls. So basically people their same age, in their same age bracket. On average, life expectancy was 10 years lower in the Inuit, and there was, based off autopsies, extensive evidence of atherosclerosis and arterial plaque accumulation. So it doesn't really appear that chugging down whale blubber and eating no fruits and vegetables over your lifespan is in any way beneficial. The diet patterns we tend to model for health, whether that's the Mediterranean or the Japanese diet, blue zones type diet, some of the Pacific Island diets and some of the other traditional hunter-gatherer population diets that we still have all contain bountiful amounts of dietary carbohydrate. It's the type of carbohydrate, obviously, that matters. But this carbohydrate hysteria that's developing now is it's just dangerous because it's guiding people away from a food group for which we have overwhelming benefit of evidence to human health. It's also guiding them towards a diet pattern that we have zero long-term evidence of any benefit to human health. And the only thing that we do have are some prospective cohort studies that would really warrant caution in blanketly recommending animal-based low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets to people, particularly for cardiovascular mortality. And there's a biological plausibility to why that would be the case in terms of the effects on LDL cholesterol that are observed with those diet patterns.
There are physiological mechanisms there that are
plausible as to why you might have a heart attack.
Probably shouldn't be ignored blanketly.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that's, I mean, I don't know if there's anything else specifically on there, apart from perhaps some, I mean, we're getting into more of the nutrients rather than food perspective there if we start talking about micronutrients in terms of, I mean, what we've touched on so far, fruit and veg, very important. Fiber, very important. Fats, more unsaturated, less saturated. Protein, it's important. Don't go crazy. Plant-based sources of it may increase the rest of your of the good stuff in your diet.
Yes.
So maybe focus a bit more on them rather than, and carbohydrates, focus on the whole grain, unrefined ones if you can.
Yeah.
Again, all of this seems very much additional rather than removing things from the diet. And I know
Right.
that that's something that
Yeah.
as it keeps coming up in regards to, we keep telling people to take things away, but maybe we should be telling people to add instead, because they'll end up taking things away without realizing.
I think so.
But then there comes that fear of, if we tell people to add, they'll get fat.
Right.
It's
But
a bit of a...
that complex hasn't exactly served us
No, it hasn't
at a public
worked, has
health
it?
level at all. Because it's not like there has been any dent made in increasing trends in chronic lifestyle disease.
Yeah.
So I think
and
this
it overly simplifies the mechanisms by which weight
Right,
gain
right,
occurs. It's not
exactly.
purely
Right.
even though it comes down eventually to that.
Yeah,
it's
but
not
it's the
purely,
factors influencing energy balance that are the big issue. And one of the funny things about nutrition as a science is, as complex as it can be, really when you come back out of all that complexity, you end up with a set of recommendations that are largely universal. Largely, the only people for whom what we've said is controversial are people for whom those statements of fact don't align with their worldview about diet and health. So it's a belief,
their nutritional identity.
right? Their nutritional identities. So it's a belief system based rejection of those facts, not a science based rejection of those facts. I think most people in nutrition, irrespective of their area or field or population practice, would broadly agree with those recommendations. So again, we're not saying there's not nuance in each of them. There is, but at the broad brush level, there is a simplicity to nutrition that is sometimes lost in all of the screaming online. And I think it is nice to bring it back to that simplicity, to make just the knowledge more accessible. The how do I get there is where things get maybe complicated in terms of certainly at the population level, but actually the information itself is more simple.
So in one sentence, if you could, if I asked you the question, when a patient comes to me and wants a very kind of helpful advice on how they can generally improve their diet, what would be? I know, I'm making you do it.
Well,
in
no, a
one
piece of
sentence,
advice.
but-
I mean, at the most simplest level.
yeah.
I think the simplest thing you could ever say to someone is eat more vegetables and fruit and carry on living your life. I really, really stand by that. If imagine if everyone did that. Imagine at a population level what health effects might occur from every single individual significantly increasing intake of a food group or group of food that's quite diverse, provides an array of beneficial compounds, and has the strongest evidence for reducing all-cause mortality across the board.
I know. But I feel like perhaps that's the utmost TLDR.
No, I thought that's what you were looking for.
No, I kind of do, but
eat
in
more
one
vegetables
sense,
and continue living your life.
There's your most condensed.
Right.
Maybe a slightly, still one sentence, but slightly expand.
Right,
Because
right.
people, look, I mean, let's be honest. We're going to say that to people, and they're going to look at us like...
I spoke at a conference last year, the audience for which was entirely medics. And my synopsis was what you had just said. I said, it's incontrovertible that fruits and vegetables are beneficial to health. Point one. Healthful diet patterns are enriched in unsaturated fat from plant and marine sources. And what we know from nutrition science now is the total fat content of the diet is less relevant than the composition of fats within it. So whether you would like a high or low fat, total fat diet is irrelevant and a matter of personal preference. But whether it's high or low, the majority of those fats should be unsaturated fats from marine and plant sources. Okay. So look, if you want to go 70% fat, that's fine. Just make sure you're drowning yourself in olive oil and not butter. And then from carbohydrate perspective, again, there isn't a diet pattern that we know that is beneficial to human health that is absent carbohydrate. They're a broad food group, and when we factor in foods like legumes and other starches, tubers and stuff, and whole grains, oats, these kind of things, it is very difficult to make a case against their inclusion in a diet. And then finally, dietary protein. If you consume animal produce, eggs and dairy, or some meats, it's probably not something that you ever really have to worry about. So for those people, I tend to say, actually focus a little bit more on increasing plant protein. Because again, by doing so, you will increase your intake of all these other compounds as well. For people that are plant-based, I would pay more attention to your dietary protein intake, because your people that are fully plant-based do have probably more so, their fat composition is typically going to be okay. Their fiber intake is going to be okay. It's actually dietary protein that they probably do want to emphasize a little bit more. So do pay attention to dietary protein if you're fully on the plant-based end of the spectrum and don't include any animal produce at all.
There you go. There was the slightly longer sentence.
Slightly longer.
That wasn't an hour long. That was the long.
Right.
So to kind of bring this one to a close, then, it's not all doom and gloom.
No.
We do know
shit.
some. We do know some
the
good
field
stuff.
isn't useless,
But-
it's produced good answers. We have enough evidence for, broadly speaking, what a decent health promoting diet pattern is. And bear in mind that with that diet pattern, we'll all still die.
Yeah, that's true. That was, again, I
So-
still think we should change the name of the podcast to Everybody Still Dies.
Yeah.
But the big but
The point there is, don't sweat it, by the way. I'm not being morbid. I'm just being like, don't make this a compulsion.
But listen, the big but on all of this is it's all well and good, but if we ignore the impact that socioeconomics and poverty in all, and we're not just talking monetarily poor, in all aspects of poverty comes into this, then we're falling into the same traps that public health keep falling into. And we're not doing anybody justice. If we tell our
Just eat more vegetables.
if we tell our single
not that
mum
simple.
of 5 who has 3 jobs and lives in a council estate that they just need to eat more fruit and veg and they'll be fine, and don't have any understanding of
Barriers.
why that would be incredibly difficult for her and her family to do, then we're being ignorant.
Right.
So as much as we do know stuff in nutrition that is good for us, and all of this is relatively good information, if we refuse to tailor that information and acknowledge that information doesn't fully fit every subsection of the population,
Right.
especially from a healthcare perspective, because we're going to see all subsets of the population, then we need to check ourselves.
And also that, when we are getting to that, so we've established, like, broadly we do know more than people will give us credit for, and we do know broadly characteristics of a healthful diet pattern. Fine. Parking that, the issues that you're correctly bringing up, it's a case of not even becoming about food then. Like, we're into discourse about, the political barriers. The solutions won't be educating someone a bit more about vegetables and fruit intake. The solutions are, obviously going to be complex and nothing that we'll ever figure out. But that's where almost the nutrition knowledge just even ceases to be relevant in a way until barriers are addressed and broken down.
Well, I think there's some, and I need to find out where exactly I've got this from, but I believe you might be able to help me here. There's some research to suggest that something like 60% of health outcomes are socioeconomically related, with only 40% of that being stuff that we are under control of.
Right.
And only a small section of that 40% is our diet. The
That's
rest being sleep, smoking, exercise.
That was the Canadian, I guess, National Institutes of Health or whatever they're called. But they modeled social determinants of health. 50% was
50 was it? Okay.
economic, 15 was genetic, and the other was, and so only something like 15% or 20% of it was kind of like really kind of diet related or directly nutrition related. And I think it's beyond so important that we start to talk about what those determinants are. It's an exhaustive list, so we kind of focus on the big picture stuff. It's also a difficult conversation for us to have because, we acknowledge that we have privilege. And we have had the benefit of growing up with access to healthcare and good food and these kind of variables. And so, but I also think that, so someone has to have these conversations. I agree it's really important to acknowledge privilege, and I do, and we do, but I also don't agree that just because you are a certain kind of a phenotype, you can't speak to these issues, because we can talk about the evidence, we can, put it out there through this medium and educate and inform people about what that evidence actually is for these issues. Without pretending that we have any of the solutions or actually understand what it's like to be in those, facing those barriers.
Yeah, 100%. So we're going to talk next episode a bit more about those socioeconomic factors that influence nutrition, which I think will bring our kind of season 1 of this to a close nicely.
Yeah.
In regards to talking about the topics that we need to be aware of, the topics that we need to have consideration for in the back of our heads in every aspect of interaction with patients, every aspect of interaction with people. If we're talking about anything to do with nutrition with people, if we ignore the identity issues in nutrition, if we ignore the fact that they may be coming in with a food is medicine rhetoric that they've gained from somewhere or some book that they found in Sainsbury's, or they are coming into these conversations with this socioeconomic status that is going to have a big impact on their ability to understand or recognize or even implement the stuff that you might suggest for them. All of these things need to be acknowledged and recognized and thought about in every interaction.
Right.
So that's I think we kind of said that was the purpose of season 1, but that's how we're going to end it in our next episode. And hopefully we'll do it a bit of justice. It's not going to be the hardest episode.
It will be the hardest episode. It's not going to be exhaustive. I don't think it can be. No. I mean, if we look at the Foresight map, that just shows just how complex and interwoven all of these issues are.
Yeah.
But we'll try and focus on some more salient aspects of it that relates to nutrition. And the example I kind of used earlier, which we can go into more detail, is the density of fast food outlets relative to areas of social deprivation. Like that's not my opinion. There's published research to support that. And so the next episode, we very much are going to be focused on the evidence for these issues.
Yeah.
And it's rather extensive, and it's kind of depressing. And I think if there's a net effect that comes out of that, I think we just need people to be angry. I think food needs to be a political issue. It is politicized, but I think it needs to get to the point where we're now thinking about who we want to lead countries based on how are they going to approach population health, and not this, rampant kind of neoliberalism that we have at the minute. It's just deregulate everything, deregulate the healthcare system, deregulate taxes, let the free market decide. It's like the free market's been deciding, and we're in really, really bad health.
we need. I mean, again, opinion, but communist. we need to reduce the inequality, not increase the inequality, and everything that has happened so far over the last 15 years, if not longer, has increased the inequality.
Yeah.
So we'll see what we can do in the next episode.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us in this one.
Hopefully, those of you that think this has all just been negative so far will get something beneficial out of that episode and be able to be like, oh, okay, that's positive. We actually know some stuff about nutrition.
And we will see you in the next one.
Sometimes I smile. It's not frequent.